I was far from the place of my nativity, with all my future life a long, waste, barren desert.
There is no shadow of the law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death. All these are inflicted by fiends who bear the shape of men. Harriet Jacobs.
When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets there is a God, a heaven.
He lashed me until he had worn out his switches, cutting me
being
so
returned to his
savagely
master,
as to
he
leave
Master
the marks
wants you in
visible
his
for a
study.
he gave her
long
10
time
I
lashes.
found
after.
this
He
door
sprang
ajar
upon
and
me my
slept
actions
tiger
to the
and
resolution.
gave
I
yourself
seized
as
Kobe,
I
hard
required.
Cheerless, hopeless, lifeless slavery. Charles Ball.
Slave narrative is a narrative, a story told by an ex-slave that recounts his or her life in slavery.
The importance is that it laid a framework on top of some of the early works that led to personal stories and expanded more into documenting African American culture.
The earlier narratives that I would call I narratives, that is, narratives based on eyewitness experience and testimony. So the people who wrote these narratives were people who were eyewitnesses to slavery.
To say, slavery is not this benign institution. It's a system of brutality that denies the humanity of people.
And every slave, as ex-slave and slave, recognized the evil nature, the dehumanizing nature of slavery.
The autobiographies of people who went through slavery continue to be tremendously important in terms of public memory.
The nation's founded on slavery, so to have the voices of slaves themselves, I think, is critical to understanding American history. You really can't understand American freedom unless you understand slavery.
A common characteristic of slave narratives is beatings and violence.
He says, he was able to successfully fight off these wild animals because he wasn't tied. He wasn't bound by slave owners. And so that was the fight with the animals was a more fair fight than any slave would experience at the hands of a slave owner.
That morning, the overseer was calling over all the names of a whole from a little book, and the first name I heard was that of my companion, Lydia. My name was the last on the list, and when it was called, I was ordered into the yard. Lydia came up out of breath and, following us into the yard, dropped to her knees before the overseer and begged him to forgive her. "Where have you been?" he said. Poor Lydia now burst into tears and said, "I only stopped to talk a while to this man." "Lie down," was his reply. Lydia fell prostrate upon the ground when he gave her 10 lashes with his long whip, every touch of which brought blood and a shriek from the sufferer.
And in particular with the slave narratives, I believe that it helped to dispel a lot of myths related to slavery itself.
Because the assumption was that slavery was a comparatively benevolent institution. We now know, and every scholar, everyone who is at all familiar with slavery understands that violence is the bolt on which slavery depends. Without violence, slavery cannot exist.
There's another discussion that goes on in this society that we need to address, and that's one of gender issues. That particular aspect of the genre was still developing.
And so you have a have a Harriet Jacobs by 1861 actually writing her autobiography herself.
So Harriet was purchased by a Dr. Flint. His name was Norcom, but in the narrative of Dr. Flint when she was, I think, 11 years old. And much of her narrative is about coming of age as an adolescent who is relentlessly harassed.
So you want to be married, do you? And to a free nigga? Yes, sir. If you must have a husband, you may take up with one of my slaves. I replied, do you suppose that all men are alike to her? Do you love this nigga? Said he abruptly. Yes, sir, I said. How dare you tell me so, he exclaimed. I suppose you thought more of yourself, that you felt above the insult of such puppies. The man you called a puppy never insulted me, sir, and he would not love me if he did not believe me to be a virtuous woman. He sprang upon me like a tiger and gave me a stunning blow. You have struck me for answering honestly, I said. Do you know that I have the right to do as I like with you? You have tried to kill me and I wish you had, I said, but you have no right to do as you like with me. If you behave yourself and do as I require, said he, I will forgive you and treat you as I've always done. If I ever know of you speaking to him, I will cowhide you both. And if I catch him lurking about my premises, I will shoot him as I would a dog. Harriet Jacobs.
One of the things that's important in her telling is that it shows the particular kinds of violence that slave women faced, and it gives a sort of lie to the idea that slaves themselves are the people who are morally depraved. But she doesn't want to leave her children behind in slavery, so she hides for 7 years in her grandmother's attic, keeping an eye on them until she actually does escape in 1842. It says something about the importance of family ties despite the legalities of slavery that don't recognize families as a reality for slaves.
Every female slave had to deal with the prospect of being raped. Those who were, like Heckley or Jacobs, had to do so in a way that was clear to the audience that was a major event in their lives.
She doesn't give explicit details, but she gives enough detail to know what the advances are.
What it did was allow women such as Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and some of the others to talk about what it meant to be not only a slave, but to be a female.
When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets there is a God, a heaven. He forgets everything in his struggle to get beyond the reach of the bloodhounds. Harriet Jacobs.
We went to a place in the forest. My new friend now desired me to look at his back. The skin had been again and again cut away and renewed by the hand of nature, until it was grown fast to the flesh and felt hard and turbid. He told me his name was Paul, that he was a native of Congo, that he had left an aged mother, a widow at home, and also a wife, that it had been his misfortune to fall into the hands of a master who was frequently drunk and whose temper was so savage, but through some unaccountable caprice, he had contracted a particular dislike against Paul. He informed me that he had first run away from his master more than 2 years ago after being whipped with long hickory switches until he fainted, but was finally betrayed by a woman whom he sometimes visited. On being returned to his master, he was again whipped, and then the iron collar that he now wore was put upon him. I advised Paul to bear his misfortunes as well as he could until the next Sunday, when I would return and bring with me a file and other things necessary to the removal of his fetters. When I arrived at the quarter that Sunday, all was quiet. The lifeless and putrid body of the unhappy Paul hung suspended by a cord made of twisted hickory bark, passed in the form of a halter round the neck, and firmly bound to a limb of the tree.
But gradually in the 1840s and 1850s, the I narratives become I narratives. That is, they're narratives not just about an institution.
So I think that's one of the things that's important about Jacobs. She, like Douglas, becomes an abolitionist. So the narrative itself is her life story. It's an anti-slavery story.
But it also allowed for showing distinctions in our personalities and showing pretty much that these beings who were thought of as chattel were actually, people that considered their stations and they weren't happy in that situation.
The big challenge for many of the narrators was to overcome white resistance to the stories that they had to tell. How do I tell the story? And it really comes down to, well, how much can I say?
They needed to create performative characters. It needed to be a work of art.
So the writers of the slave narratives choose to frame their depictions of slavery in ways that serve that purpose at the expense of giving us full-blown autobiographical pieces.
You also realize how self-conscious black male writers are about allowing that image of the black man to be the dominant image.
Douglas, part of his brilliance is knowing when to employ instances of resistance. His fight with Covey.
The fight with Covey was sort of a resurrection for him. That this is someone who's been brutalizing him because he's a slave breaker, been brutalizing him since he encountered him.
I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. My cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. Frederick Douglass. The slave breaker, Mr. Covey, was a hard-working man, ready to urge us on with his words and his whip. We used to call him, among ourselves, the Snake. On a Monday morning, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades from the loft, Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope. He caught hold of my legs and was about tying me. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight. I seized Covey, and as I did so, I rose. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I was determined to be used so no longer. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half as much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all.
When he beats Covey, he says that Covey never touched him again. This is a turning point, and he felt like a man. So, the point, I think, is not to advocate violence.
If they have to fight, they do fight in the narratives, but they don't go out looking for a fight.
The lesson isn't in the violence itself, which we know that's a part of it. The lesson is in the human spirit to persevere and to overcome, and for this people who endured all of these things and yet and still to keep themselves going.
Freedom is always the pinnacle of the story. It's like how people become free and how they've overcome the brutalities of slavery.
We had to come together and make a collective effort, and it took not only the slaves themselves, because these freedom seekers had very little power of their own.
The narratives are pertinent to today's issues because they give us a historical perspective on what freedom has meant historically to people who didn't have it.
Slave narratives shed some light on the nature of racism and the nature of prejudice and the kinds of assumptions, particularly that white people had then. I think that those assumptions and prejudices and racist ideas then still have their resonance now. It's not as though white America gave up.
When you talk to our young people, both black and white and various different nationalities, this collective memory that we all should have had is kind of diminishing as we go in time.
If we understand where these prejudices, assumptions, fears, racist notions come from in the slavery era, and how they affect the way black writers even back then try to address their white audience, I think we have a better chance of understanding how those messages can tally with what people are saying today.
But it also allows us to appreciate our collective development as a nation.
I think the narratives themselves were and continue to speak to a broad American audience. I mean, this is an American experience, and so I think that they're critical for people who want to understand American experiences to read.
And I think that's what literature teaches us, an appreciation for the untold stories, the untold histories. How did certain situations within the development of our nation make us feel? And often that's the particular part that needs to be discussed. We have to keep that progress going, and that's what African American literature allows us to do, is to examine the past and to prepare a brighter future for our children and generations to come from the lessons that we've learned.
It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. Let but the first opportunity offer, and come what will, I am off. It may be that my misery in slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There is a better day coming. Frederick Douglass.